Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's learning lesson, Forests and REDD+ Outcomes from COP21. I think we are ready to get started. So hopefully more people will be joining us as time comes on, since it's just now 10. So welcome again to our learning lesson organized by World Wildlife Fund's Forest and Climate Program. Thanks for taking the time to join us. My name is Emmeline Gasparini, and I am a program associate with the Forest and Climate Program. And our presenters today are Josefina Braña-Varela, the Policy Director, and Peter Graham, Program Lead, both of the Forest and Climate Program. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few logistics and some frequently asked questions. For those of you who have participated in past sessions, this will sound familiar, but yes, today's presentation is being recorded, and you can find the recording within a few days on our YouTube channel. To get to the recording, simply go to youtube.com and search for WWF Forest and Climate. There are two audio options. You can listen through your computer or dial in through the phone number that was provided in your registration email. It's important to note that if you experience audio difficulties while listening through your computer, those are sometimes caused by having too many browser windows open at once. So feel free to close some of them, which usually solves the issue, or you're also welcome to join by phone. If you're having any technical difficulties, please send Jenny Guzman a message via the chat area and we'll try to get it sorted out. Questions are absolutely welcome. You can send your questions anytime during the webinar using the toolbar on your screen. We will answer as many as possible during our allotted time. After the webinar, you'll receive a link in your follow-up email with additional forest and climate resources from WWF, including a link to the YouTube channel where you can watch the recording of this session. Thank you again for joining us, and with that, we'll get started. So Peter and Josefina, take it away.
Thank you very much, Emmeline. Welcome, everyone. This is Peter Graham here. And I'm going to start off with some brief introductory comments and then hand over to Josefina, who will get into the details of the forest aspects of the Paris Agreement. So first of all, the adoption of the Paris Agreement on the 12th of December, an historic agreement to combat climate change and unleash actions and investment towards a low-carbon and resilient, sustainable future was agreed by 195 nations in Paris. Now, this was but a significant milestone along the way. The fact that the Paris Agreement was adopted at the 21st Conference of the Parties to the UNFCCC should give you a clear indication that this was one of a number of milestones in the UNFCCC's mission. From Rio in 1992 to Kyoto in 1997 to Copenhagen in 2009 and then to Durban in 2011, which actually launched this push to Paris and the ultimate outcome. So one of the key aspects of this milestone was that after the failure to reach a comprehensive agreement in Copenhagen, the last push, significant efforts were made to rebuild trust in the multilateral process towards Paris, ultimately being a success. What is the significance of the deal? Well, while the tragedy in Paris a few weeks before the conference reminded everyone that there are real threats to citizens posed by terrorism, the commitment of more than 150 heads of state to actually attend the launch of COP21 in Paris in person demonstrated the resolve to address the global threat to citizens and the governments of the threat to climate change. This was in question after the terrorist attacks, but the fact that these leaders did agree to come was a real significance, did show a real significance of the importance of addressing this. Now, the Paris Agreement for the first time brings all nations into a common cause based on the historic, current, and future responsibilities. 195 nations reached agreement to collectively act to cut greenhouse gas emissions to a level that will limit the global average temperature to a rise well below 2 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. This significantly included both developed and developing countries making formal commitments to sharing responsibility for tackling climate change. Sorry, next slide, please, Jenny. And sorry, missed that. And one more. Next slide, please. And one more. Okay. So, but what is the purpose of this agreement? What does it actually entail? What does it do? The purpose is to contribute to the ultimate objective of the Convention and strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty, including specifically in 3 areas. 1, holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius, as I mentioned, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Secondly, it increases the ability to adapt to adverse impacts of climate change and foster resilience and low greenhouse gas emissions development in a manner that does not threaten food production. And thirdly, making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. Now, for those of you who may not have explored the agreement and the texts in detail, I'll just quickly run through the 12-page document composed of 29 articles, which contains a few key elements that I will describe. Firstly, or significantly, on emission reductions, it establishes a long-term goal specifying that emissions should peak as soon as possible with a rapid series of reductions thereafter. In terms of national contributions, all countries must communicate their nationally determined contributions every 5 years. The acronym NDC. Every NDC should be ambitious and show progression. Thirdly, previous slide, please. The responsibility and finance section. This recognizes common but different responsibilities and respective contributions, and the CBDR and RC, and the historic responsibility of developed countries, and therefore their leadership role in addressing climate change, including by providing financial support for developing countries, both for mitigation and adaptation. Also, commitment to continue their existing goal of mobilizing $100 billion US per year until 2025. In adaptation, it establishes a qualitative adaptation goal. Loss and damage recognizes the importance of minimizing and addressing loss and damage, as well as the need to cooperate in key measures, such as early warning, preparedness, etc. And the final key element that I'll describe here is around transparency and global stock taking. So it establishes a framework for transparency, providing flexibility to countries while guaranteeing the integrity of the agreement overall, enabling a tracking of progress of action as well as of support. So that is a very sort of 20,000-foot overview of the agreement, its significance. At this point, I will hand it over to Josefina, who will go into more details, the specifics of the agreement as it relates to forest and REDD+ in particular. Josefina, over to you.
Okay, and sorry. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. And I think Peter gave us a good introduction of the agreement and the significance of Paris. And what I want to do now is to focus on the relevant part of the agreement for forests in particular. So what you can see in your slide are the parts of the agreement or the articles that have some significance for the forest agenda. We know that the preamble have some references to the importance to guaranteeing the integrity of ecosystems. And I think it makes an explicit reference to biodiversity. So that it's in general, obviously implicitly referring to the importance of conserving the forest. There's a bunch of articles, as Peter mentioned. The agreement is composed by 29 articles. I'm just going to touch on this slide on the ones that are more relevant. Article 2 of referring to purpose, he already explained to us that we want to take action to keep us below the dangerous temperatures. And forests, of course, for many countries are a key sector that will contribute. As part of the profile of emissions of different countries, forests can play a key role. In terms of communications of the INDCs, because some countries or most of the countries have sent INDCs that are economy-wide, we now have some further provisions on how the INDCs have to be communicated, and I think there's a lot of space for working with forest countries to make sure that these are including action in the forest sector. And Article 4, you will find provisions about mitigation that are going to be key. And that set kind of like the mitigation framework for the whole agreement, and that's important to keep an eye on that. Article 5, I'm going to leave for now because we are going to go into detail. It's one that refers to forest and land. Article 6 also, I'm going to want to talk a little bit more in detail with you about it. And I guess the other two articles that are relevant are the finance article, which is sector neutral. It's very general, but it has important provisions, as well as the decisions that accompany the Paris Agreement. Will have, if you find in paragraph 55, the section that are the decisions that refer to finance, there's also some references to important for forest. And as Peter mentioned already, also Article 13 of the agreement talks about transparency, and there are certain provisions there that will be relevant for our discussions today. Okay, can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so let's just dive in completely in what the Paris Agreement says explicitly about forest and land. As you know, the discussions have been taking place for many years, and we were under the uncertainty of whether forests would be explicitly mentioned or recognized in the agreement, and we actually didn't know until the last moment whether we were going to be able to have an explicit reference. We knew that in the negotiation text that we saw, in particular in the last year from the session in Geneva until Paris, that there were some mentions, there were some attempts to make reference to the forest sector, either explicitly using the word or using some terminology that implicitly would refer to forests, like, for example, using terminology like sources or sinks, in particular sinks or removals. So there was like these two approaches. Whether we were going to get an explicit article was really uncertain. Let alone an article, just like an explicit mention in the agreement. And it was looking very possible, very feasible, that we were going to get some reference, implicit or explicit, in the mitigation article. What you see at the end coming out of Paris is that we had a standalone article that refers to forest and land. And it's a very small, very short article. It only is composed of 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph invites pretty much all states to take action and to conserve and enhance sinks and reservoirs. So I think it's important because it is not talking about developing or developed countries, but it actually encourages all parties to take action in the sector. And by using the terminology of sinks and reservoirs, is not it's leaving the door open for the whole land sector. But at the end of the article, you will find an explicit reference to forest because it says including forest. So that we were very happy to see this mention and this encouragement and the recognition that that forests are a key piece of the climate agreement. The second paragraph of the Article 5 referred more to the encouragement to take action to implement and support. So I think this article is, this paragraph is targeting to both developing and developed countries. Implement, the part of implementing is encouraging forest countries to keep taking action, keep moving forward with their strategies to address drivers of deforestation. And the part of support is encouraging the donors and developed countries to provide the financial support that is needed for countries to keep making shifts towards low carbon development economies. So I think it's very important to highlight these two parts of the article in terms of implementation of support. The other feature to highlight is that although the article is very short, it was very carefully crafted in terms to try to achieve some balance and to try to reflect the different interests of parties in the negotiations table. As you can see in that paragraph 2 of Article 5, there's an explicit reference to REDD+ using the common language in the convention. So we never use REDD+ as an acronym, but we refer to the policy approaches and positive incentives for activities relating to reducing emissions from deforestation, forest degradation, etc. So that language that is included there pretty much is translating into REDD+. And there's also a mention of alternative policy approaches, such as joint mitigation and adaptation approaches for the integral sustainable management of forest. As many of you may remember, this language refers to the joint mitigation and adaptation mechanism that was first proposed by Bolivia. So there's a careful balance on including REDD+ and the joint mitigation and adaptation mechanism, but it also reflects the interest of another group of countries that was really pushing forward to get a recognition of the importance of non-carbon benefits. And this is pretty much was led by the African group. And for them, it was important to recognize the key or the importance to incentivize non-carbon benefits. So my point here, I guess, is that although the Article 5 is a very short article, it's a standalone article for forest and land, which is a huge success if you take into account that the rest of the agreement is very sector neutral. So we are happy to see this as an encouragement to countries to keep taking action in this sector. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so the other feature that we find in this very short text is a reference to results-based payments. This is a mention in the second paragraph that is included after encouraging parties to take action to implement and support. It says including results-based payments, and I think this is it's a good signal to keep providing the reassurance that there would be incentives to make all the efforts that developing countries need to take on to address the drivers of deforestation. The other part of the text makes reference to the framework. So it says to take action to implement and support the existing framework. As many of you know, there was a very long discussions on whether REDD+ should be characterized as a mechanism under the convention. This was part of the negotiations throughout the months, but more intensively in the last part of last year and in Paris. Very heated discussions among parties whether we should be characterizing REDD+ as a mechanism or just like taking on the same language that parties have been using so far. At the end, what we see is as a result or as a compromise text is the recognition of the existing framework. And I think this is important because this gives certainty that all the decisions and the work that has been done under the convention throughout the years, it's formally recognized in the Paris Agreement and therefore in the new climate regime. So I guess the key result that we can see from the Paris discussions is that REDD+ is formally recognized, and there is a good foundation to continue the efforts post 2020. As you may know, the majority of multilateral mechanisms and the bilateral cooperation goes only to 2020. So with this Article 5, I think we have a good foundation to guarantee that the efforts should be continuing after 2020, and recognizing that many countries will need more time to actually be able to address the drivers of deforestation and forest degradation and make a shift towards low carbon development economies. So I think it's important in that sense, and the explicit mention of forests that we have been calling for since the beginning, it is key to send the political message to countries and to explicitly to governments that the forest sector is a key piece of the agreement, and that it is important, and it is as important as the work in other sectors. So we got that in the agreement. Can we go to the next slide? Because what I want to do now, it's touch a little bit more in depth on the other highlights of the agreement that are key or that are related to forest. So we have as I mentioned before, in Article 6, the establishment of a mitigation and sustainable development mechanism. This mechanism is established in the Paris Agreement, but further work will be needed to work out the modalities, procedures, and even governance structure of such a mechanism. But the key features or what is mentioned in the agreement is that this mechanism will allow or is allowing for voluntary cooperation in the implementation of the national determined contributions. And the intention is to give this avenue of joint work or collaboration to reach higher ambition. And I think why sustainable development is in the name of the mechanism is because everybody recognizes that all efforts towards tackling climate change need to take into consideration the needs of developing countries in terms of economic development and also in terms of poverty alleviation. But another key or a new acronym that you will be hearing more and more as we move forward with the agreement and its implementation is this acronym that you can see in the slide, that is ITMO. And what it means is an internationally transferred mitigation outcome. And this is a new type of asset or climate asset, and we don't know how this is going to work out. We don't know how these internationally transferred mitigation outcomes will be transferred or what are the rules, but this is already established in the agreement, and what we also don't know is how the forest sector will fit in this mechanism. What we know is in Article 6, there is provisions or mentions about market and also non-market, which keeps leaving the door open and the flexibility for countries to approach their mitigation efforts in the most appropriate way for the national context. Okay, can we please go to the next slide? The other article that it's relevant for our discussions on forest is Article 9 of the Paris Agreement, which relates to finance. As I mentioned before, the article pretty much is it doesn't make any reference to any sector. It's very general, but it states that developed countries should provide financial resources to assist developing countries in both mitigation and adaptation efforts. I think one of the key messages here is that the finance needs to be the provision of finance needs to be balanced. So I guess this explicit mention on the balance between mitigation and adaptation was a concern from many developing countries, and they wanted to make sure that the support provided is not going to be only for mitigation, but actually to help the most vulnerable countries to adapt. There's other provisions in this article that talk about monitoring and tracking on finance, which is a good practice that we see as contributing to the transparency of the agreement. And then there's also the recognition of the importance of the financial resources for REDD+ and the JMA, but this is not part of Article 9. This is part of the finance decisions that accompany the agreement. So this is the paragraph 55 of the decisions. To be honest, the language is not new or strong because it is not encouraging or committing countries to provide the finance. But the language is very general, saying that recognizing the importance of financial resources or adequate and predictable support for REDD+ and JMA. So although the language is not very strong, the mention is there, and I think this it's a good complement for Article 5 and other provisions on transparency in the agreement. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. Article 13 is, I think, the last article I wanted to bring to your attention. And this article, it's about transparency. So what the article is doing is creating or establishing a transparency framework. And the language recognizes that it will build on and enhance former transparency arrangements. The Copenhagen and Cancun agreements have built already a system for transparency and accountability. There has been efforts before to require that countries regularly report their emissions and their actions and how they are progressing, or what is the trajectory to their target, to meeting their targets. And there was already independent expert review of the country reports. But I guess what the Paris Agreement is aiming to do is trying to strengthen this system in several ways. And one of these main I guess features is the establishment or the creation of this new framework. And there's going to be a mechanism to facilitate the implementation and compliance. And the agreement kind of like sets the foundation to build on a common set of rules, which is a big difference, because now both developed and developing countries will have to observe these rules and submit information accordingly, which before the only ones that had the obligation were the developed countries. So I guess this is still recognizing the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, but it's also kind of like giving the big push for being transparent and to provide the information. So some of the new or the key features that are elaborated in the agreement and in the decisions that accompany the agreement refer to requiring that countries regularly report their national emissions inventories and using good practice methodologies of the IPCC, and it also requires that at least every 2 years countries report and information that will allow us to track progress. So and this progress or the tracking of progress is not only in terms of actions towards reducing emissions, but actually, on terms of adaptation, etc. But it also talks about tracking progress on financial commitments. I guess the provisions that are in the agreement are a foundation, and there's still much work to be done, so that you will be seeing the subsidiary bodies of the convention developing further work in terms of modalities, procedures, and guidelines. For the forest sector in particular, it's going to be very important to see how the discussions on accounting frameworks will evolve, because one of the things that the agreement states is that there's some mandate that countries will use a common accounting framework for tracking progress. So if we really want to see how we are progressing globally, we need to have common rules, and this accounting framework will need to be developed, and this is going to be key and impacting directly the forest and the land sector. So we'll have to keep an eye and see how this evolves. Okay, let's. I think with this slide we finish the highlights of the Paris Agreement and how these provisions may be relevant for forests. What I would do now is to switch very quickly to another part of what happened in Paris. And I think the discussions and negotiations were, of course, the core of the outcome in Paris, but there were key ingredients of success and other things happening that contributed to build the momentum and to create a good environment for countries to come together and adopt the agreement. So with that, let's go to the next slide, because I want to talk very briefly about the Lima Paris Action Agenda. This action agenda was one of the, we believe that it was one of the key ingredients for guaranteeing the inclusion and explicit mention of forest in the agreement. So the Lima Paris Action Agenda, or the LPAA, as it refers commonly, it's an initiative that was led by four main key actors: the incoming and outgoing presidencies, Peru and France, and the UN Secretary General Executive Office, and the UNFCCC Secretariat. So these four key players came together at the end of the COP in Lima and announced that they will launch this initiative or this action agenda to catalyze action on climate change that increases ambition before 2020, and that could support the new climate agreement. So it was launched a year before Paris, and it tried to show that many things were already taking place, to show that this climate action can happen and is already happening, and how we can catalyze and scale up this type of initiatives that not necessarily are efforts from governments, but that could include other actors. The Lima Paris Action Agenda had different pillars. It had around 12 different pillars ranging from energy, transport, cities, agriculture, etc. And one of the main pillars was the forest pillar. So how the forest pillar was structured it was led by the government of Peru, and they framed it as an opportunity to show greater ambition in the forest sector. And they wanted to show the renewed international leadership, particularly by forest countries. They wanted to show strong commitments by developed countries to support further ambitious action. And they also wanted to provide a platform for new commitments by non-state actors. So how this forest pillar was pretty much structured was as a platform to show how state and non-state actors could come together and collaborate or establish ambitious partnerships that could allow countries to be more ambitious, knowing that many countries have already sent their nationally determined contributions, and that most of them were economy-wide and a little bit difficult to understand how the forests contribute to these NDCs. The forest pillar tried to see if it was there was a way to clarify how the forest sector will contribute to achieve these national targets. And through to state and non-state actors, create a platform for partnerships that could catalyze action and also to deliver resource faster to close the gigaton gap. Can we, well, before going to the next slide, I just want to say that the Lima Paris Action Agenda had in Paris different days, action days. So there was a forest day in which the main partnerships were announced and presented. There were several thematic panels, and the forest pillar was accompanied by different announcements and commitments from different players. So let's go to the next slide, because I just wanted to mention a few examples on what was catalyzed by this action agenda. So Germany, Norway, and the UK pledged $5 billion up to 2020 with the intention to scale up finance to $1 billion per year after 2020. So I think this restates the leadership that these three countries have been playing in the forest agenda. But we also saw private sector being very active and participating and engaging and trying to see how they could contribute in the context of Paris, but also in the context of the New York Declaration on Forests, where many companies have stated or pledged to become deforestation free. So you can see Marks and Spencer and as well as Unilever making a public statement committing to source commodities from regions that will meet social and environmental safeguards, and in particularly prioritizing sustainably sourced palm oil, beef, paper, and other commodities. And then just to complement, we saw in Paris a very active indigenous people's agenda, and we saw many indigenous groups from all around the world coming together and being very vocal about the need to take them into consideration and also support their action. And there was some follow-up discussions on their pledge that they did in New York in 2014 around protecting 400 million hectares of forest. So this is just a range of different stakeholders, just to give you an idea of how the outside track of the negotiations was playing and how multiple stakeholders came and were very vocal. So with this, I'm going to give the microphone back to Peter so he can share with us other key ingredients of success in Paris and to help us close the webinar and open for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Josefina. And the next slide, please, then. We get a lot of questions, or certainly after Paris, about, was this a success only thanks to the amazing diplomacy of the French presidency, or what was the impact of the climate marches in New York, and what was the impact of, say, the business leaders or the religious leaders? So I just wanted to cover a few of the points related to how success was achieved in Paris. It's partly a message on how we can help to implement action and who needs to be involved and who needs to continue to be involved and how. So one of the key ingredients was the leadership from key countries on the road to Paris. Sorry, back to that overview slide, please. Paris was the culmination of years of work, of diplomacy, of engagement, of bilateral and multilateral trust building, and even building of action plans and agreements. Now, people say, how important was, say, the U.S. and China deal? Well, in fact, to my mind, it was a very important to the success in Paris. It raised expectations for other G20 nations to prepare to find pragmatic solutions to the differentiation stalemate, for example, and also to see how their economies could move forward in development, in green development together through partnerships. Other countries that showed influential leadership included Mexico and Brazil, for example, through submitting their indicative nationally determined contributions in time, pledging resources to the Green Climate Fund, and other examples. Without such leadership from individual countries and in partnership ahead of the COP, it was unlikely that we would have seen the success that we did. Now, the French presidency did play a key role. For those of you in following the president and his ministers over the course of the year or two ahead of time, the engagement at the head of state level was critical. As we said at the beginning, there are over 150 heads of state, national leaders who attended the launch of the COP, and that represented the success of the French presidency, along with Ban Ki-moon and other international leaders, to maintain and raise the climate change topic at the top of the agendas of these countries, or at least among other top issues for these countries. Also, the leadership of non-state actors. One of the examples there, which was related to the French leadership, was the summit series on climate and territories, which brought together provincial, territorial, and city leaders, mayors, to show how mitigation adaptation is being achieved and can be further achieved at that level below the state level. And that support, as we know, cities play a key role in countries' economies, in the livelihoods of citizens, and in the politics. And so success at that level was critical as well. And bringing that up into each international fora was a key element of the success. The mobilization of civil society, while in Paris that was subdued due to the increased security, the increasing role of the general public, broad civil society, began in earnest after Copenhagen. There was obviously the bit of a reality check, a mild depression, put it that way, in the NGO community and civil society around the failure in Copenhagen to reach a comprehensive outcome. But it took a different direction after then, and certainly intensified between the Warsaw COP and Paris. One of the milestones in civil society participation was actually the climate summit and the marches in New York and around the world in 2014. The Lima-Paris Action Agenda, this is similar to the role of non-state actors, as Josefina spoke to the forest pillar of the Lima-Paris Action Agenda. The efforts and pledges and commitments under the other pillars, including energy, transportation, cities, agriculture, and others, contributed to the ability for countries to gain the confidence that they could achieve more ambition with the support of the various stakeholders. Also, in the run-up to Paris, it established an external process outside of the formal negotiations, which provided some flexibility for governments and non-state actors to make those commitments and to raise and define the ambition in a way that they might not have been able to do in the formal setting of negotiations prior to leading up to the adoption of the Paris Agreement. While we may have hoped for more commitments, say, commitments between deals with developing countries, say, around the protection of forests and financing commitments, the overall impact contribute to the success of the overall deal, in our opinion. So at this point, I'm going to provide some further reflections. Next slide, please. Some final thoughts on the Paris Agreement and its implications. Now, was it a perfect agreement? No. And we obviously, while we had hoped for a perfect agreement, we expected a good agreement. And this, we feel that we did achieve. It lays a good foundation and framework to produce the urgent changes in human activity needed to avoid dangerous climate change and temperature rise. One of the key aspects, though, is, and the criticisms of the agreement, is that it doesn't, some people say it's not, where is the real legally binding nature of it? What do countries have to do today, tomorrow, the next day? This points to the responsibility of the individual nations and stakeholders to actually follow up on the agreement. If nobody takes any action to catalyze a policy change across governments, industry, or financial markets and within society at large, we won't actually achieve the ambition that is represented in the agreement, nor build the ambition necessary to address the problem that science says that we need to address. So, in the context of forests, while we were hoping, well, let's just see, coming into it, we were hoping for a clear and strong recognition of the role of forests and land use in the agreement. That I feel we got. Certainly we would have liked a bit more detail here and there on how the forests and land use issues would be addressed. But in general, there is that recognition, and there are processes through which we can continue to tighten up the environmental integrity of the agreement and the actions undertaken by the parties. Around financing to support forest conservation, or REDD+, we hoped for more, again, more detail, but we ended up with what we call a hook or a hanger through which we can pursue the linkage of financing through the Green Climate Fund, for example, and through bilateral relations and other mechanisms to support mitigation adaptation in the forest and land sector. Next slide, please. So with the overall perspective, the agreement does represent a major pivot point. It's a milestone representing a step change in the global consensus on addressing the real threat of climate change. As I said, actions are needed to be implemented by multiplicity of actors from governments and private sector and civil society at large. Paris itself is not the end of the road, even in the UNFCCC process. There is already COP21 planned for Marrakesh in Morocco at the end of this year, and as part of the work that's identified is the work to advance the technical issues on, for example, modalities and procedures for sustainable development mechanism, transparency framework, and others. As well, a key piece of the work ahead is the review of the nationally determined contributions. If these are the key pieces that represent the sort of the legally binding nature, the commitment to achieve the ambition described in the agreement, then we need to dig into the review process a little bit more and focus on the integrity of the actions and reporting and the validation of the results. As well, the global stock taking, how close are we getting to achieving the ambition of a 1.5 or significantly below 2 degree temperature rise goals. And that is going to require, as we know, an increase in ambition. So assessing where we're at on a regular basis and having an open and transparent process through which that is carried out is going to be critical, and that, from our point of view, will require continued engagement in the process and continued advocacy with the countries themselves. One key thing is around when do we act, and as we know, while the agreement is for a post-2020 climate regime, we need to act now. And we are, in many cases, are already acting now in a number of areas. We've already seen a shift in energy use in many countries, in solar use, in rates of deforestation, including in Brazil. But there's a lot more to do, and we have the tools to do it. We, in many cases, know what needs to be done, and so it's a matter of implementing and making the changes necessary to achieve as much emission reduction and implement measures for adaptation now, before 2020, so that our task post-2020 is easier, achievable, and less costly financially and in terms of human lives and effort. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Emmeline to manage the question and answer session. But thank you all, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Josefina. And I also want to thank everyone for their patience through our strange technical difficulties today. We got a very good number of questions, so I'm going to try to send as many of them to our presenters as possible. But if we don't get to your question and you really are burning for an answer, feel free to email me and I can facilitate some conversation. Let's get started. The first question I have here, what is the significance that the REDD acronym is not used in the Paris Agreement, but that it is always spelled out as reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation in lowercase letters? So, Josefina, you want to take this one first?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Emmeline. I can give it a try, and then Peter, if please feel to jump in. So, since the beginning of the negotiations, we haven't been seeing the acronym in the text of the UNFCCC, and I think it's just because parties agreed on a concept and not into you just want to make sure that they are talking about the same thing. So the risk when using acronyms, if you don't have elaborated the whole concept, it could become whatever. And I think that's happened with REDD in the real world. Like some people have like an aversion to talk about REDD when just look at the label and not understanding all the features of the concept. So there's no, I don't see any risk or any problem with not having REDD as an acronym in the Paris Agreement, just because the normal language that has been used always in the convention is there in the agreement, and in the Cancun agreements you have the definition of REDD plus, pretty much the 5 activities that are included and that constitute REDD plus. The other thing is that there's always been this tension on whether you call REDD plus a mechanism under the convention. Like, for example, the Clean Development Mechanism is a mechanism under the convention that has governance structure, rules, procedures, etc. So I think parties were always very careful to keep REDD plus as some approach that would be more flexible and would not need so much of a heavy governance structure, at least not in the sense similar to the CDM. So I think I will leave it like that. I don't see any problems. I think actually the outcome on Article 5 is quite positive for forests and for REDD plus, and from the JMA, which is Joint Mitigation and Adaptation approach, because we saw there's a question about what is JMA. That's JMA stands for Joint Mitigation and Adaptation. So I don't know, Peter, if you want to elaborate on that.
No, I think you covered it well there. It's also just common legal practice to refer to to be as consistent as possible, so that the decisions previously adopted are fully recognized through the use of similar terminology in future decisions.
Okay, great. You gave me a nice segue into this question. Legally speaking, is the agreement binding? And what happens if a country doesn't meet its targets? So I'll give this to Josefina to start off.
Thanks, Emmeline. I think this is a very interesting question, and I think it's a tricky one because I think there was many discussions about the legally binding nature of the agreement and the inability of some parties to sign something that would be purely legally binding. So what we see is a mixed approach in which the agreement has some binding elements. For example, the reporting requirements are binding, but what is not binding and it's not part of the agreement is this contributions from countries. So in that sense, I would characterize it as a mixed approach. And although the NDCs are not legally binding, hopefully we are hoping that the transparency framework will allow us to hold accountable countries that are not actually meeting their targets. But also hopefully the discussions and the process in Paris and the outcomes in Paris will reinforce that meeting the targets is in their own interest of the countries. But that part is not binding as opposed to other elements like the reporting and the review process.
I might just add to that through the process of the negotiations on this issue, obviously an issue right to the end, was the recognition of domestically legally binding measures or legislation. And so that was one of the arguments where if the domestic law is often stronger than international law in terms of enforceability, and so the pressure will be on and the role of civil society and policymakers in the individual countries to enact and implement legislation and policies that have legal impact, legal effect within the countries, aligned with countries' nationally determined contributions.
Okay, thank you. So my question for the speakers is, will financing from the Paris Agreement be geared strictly to REDD+ initiatives, or will smaller scale forestry/afforestation be part of our solution? Our NGO operates in Armenia. We wonder if we may see benefits or support from Paris Agreement, primarily in afforestation on a smaller scale with sustainable development co-benefits. What is the best way to remain in the loop for these opportunities in coming months? So 2 questions there, and I'll let Peter start this one off.
Thanks. Thank you for the question. And the moment as Josefina described in terms of the mechanisms that are currently in place, the clean development mechanism at this point still exists, and so afforestation, reforestation activities within that mechanism would still be part of the incentive mix. So I think to your question, that's probably the most direct. At this point, we see that continuing. Whether there will be an expansion of activities under the clean development mechanism or an expanded use of the clean development mechanism, for example, connection to national greenhouse gas strategies or systems, whether market systems or non, is an open question. We see developments in various countries that would indicate continued interest in accessing CDM or using it as a way to either contribute to domestic or international or global mitigation efforts. But within the context of a national policy, this is where I think it's useful to consider when you're, for example, in Armenia, looking at how do your projects contribute to achieving the national contribution or commitment to mitigation. And so the better that you can link to a national commitment, I think the better you will have chances to access broader pools of support, both domestically, politically, but also to support from international climate finance.
I'm going to squeeze in one last question because I think this is a really important one. Does the Paris Agreement leave open the possibility to have regulated carbon markets? Are forests included, and how? And I'm going to give this to Josefina.
Sure, Emmeline, thank you. And I think this is a very relevant question. As you mentioned, we briefly discussed in the presentation Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, it starts setting some provisions or opens the door for a future regulated market. I don't know if we can use regulated market. It's still up in the air, but what the agreement is doing is setting the foundations for further for developing this further. And I think the use of this new term of excuse me, internationally transferred mitigation outcomes really opens the door for a future market. Now, how forests are inserted in this mitigation and sustainable development mechanism, it's still not clear, because the agreement only opens the door, clearly stating that this is on a voluntary basis, like countries or parties can, on a voluntary basis, decide to cooperate with each other to achieve their nationally determined contributions. So I think it's a good foundation, and leaves the door wide open for keep developing the market, a future market mechanism. But it's so broad and open, and so much more work would be needed in the months to come, that we still don't know how forests would be included and how. So I think it's a little bit of uncertainty, but there's a foundation there to keep working.
All right. Well, then I am going to call this the end of our webinar. I really want to thank everyone for participating and for sending in your really excellent questions. We will have another webinar in February. The next one is scheduled is about climate smart forestry practices. So keep your eye out for an email announcing that in the next couple of weeks. Thank you all again for joining us, and we hope to see you at our next learning lesson, and have a great rest of your day.